So, tensions between Ethiopia and Eritrea are rising again, and it looks like these countries might fight for a fourth time. For those of you who don't know where Eritrea is, don't worry, neither does 99% of the world. Both Eritrea and Ethiopia are two of the four countries located in the Horn of Africa. And as you can tell from the map, Eritrea is one of the countries landlocking Ethiopia with a big coast that looks like a tail. In fact, Eritrea looks like it specifically extended itself just to block Ethiopia from touching the coast. Was this done on purpose by them? Well, short answer yes, long answer it kind of wasn't their fault. But we'll get to this. Eritrea is considered one of the most repressive and secretive states on earth. It is so secretive in fact that there's no clear consensus on how many people live there. Depending on who you ask, Eritrea is home to either 3.5 million or 6.5 million people. Because apparently even basic population data is a state secret. What can be said for certain though is that much of Eritrea consists of coastal desert regions that frequently experience drought, which has contributed to economic hardships and frustrations among the rural population. This frustration has boiled over into several conflicts with their larger neighbor, Ethiopia, down south. These two neighbors have a love-hate relationship, mostly hate, and now thanks to coups, old grudges, and Ethiopia's need for a coastline, things are heating up again. To understand today's tensions better, let's go back 200 years when Italy showed up in Eritrea in the 1800s, because you know, imperialism. After centuries of regional conflicts, crusades, jihads, and foreign occupations, the Suez Canal finally opened in 1869, making the Red Sea a hotspot for global powers. Italy soon took interest, making its first acquisition along the Eritrean coast through the Rubattino Navigation Company. By 1885, Italian troops had occupied Massawa, Assab, and other coastal areas, facing little resistance from the Egyptians and ignoring protests from the Turks and Ethiopians. From Massawa, they expanded towards the highlands. Initially, Emperor Johannes IV of Ethiopia, who was Tigrayan, resisted Italian expansion, but his successor, Menelik II, allowed Italy to occupy territory north of the Merab River in exchange for military support. The Treaty of Wichita, signed in 1889, led to the official proclamation of Italian Eritrea in 1890. After 6 years, Italy tried to expand further into Ethiopia, breaking the agreement. However, the disastrous Battle of Adwa in 1896 led to Italy recognizing Ethiopia's sovereignty in exchange for its own control over Eritrea. This cemented a divide between Eritrea and Ethiopia that would lay the groundwork for future conflicts over territory, identity, and independence. Under Italian rule, Eritrea's cities grew, roads and railways improved, and industries developed. Asmara became a Mediterranean-style city, and Massawa's port was modernized. However, Italians took the best farmland, forcing many Eritreans into the cities. Eritrea lacked valuable resources, making the colony costly for Italy. Education was minimal, and Eritreans were excluded from governance, mainly serving as laborers and soldiers. Fast forward to the 1930s, Mussolini sought to succeed where his predecessors had failed, by conquering Ethiopia. To achieve this, about 65,000 Eritreans were recruited into the Italian army. Italy's conquest of Ethiopia in 1936 marked its peak in East Africa. However, British forces expelled the Italians in 1941, leading to a decade of British rule. During this time, Ethiopia pushed for full annexation of Eritrea, while Eritrean Muslims, fearing discrimination, formed the Muslim League in 1947 to demand independence. In 1950, the United Nations, under US influence, decided to federate Eritrea with Ethiopia within 2 years. Eritrea was granted autonomy with its own constitution and government. However, Ethiopia systematically dismantled this autonomy. Tigrinya and Arabic were made official languages, but Ethiopian authorities later suppressed Arabic education and marginalized Muslims for public employment. Political repression grew, and in 1962, Ethiopia's parliament officially annexed Eritrea, ending its federal status. Eritrean Muslims, who were obviously not happy with this, launched an armed struggle in 1961 by forming the Eritrean Liberation Front, backed by Arab nations. Later, Christian communist Eritreans joined, leading to the rise of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, or the EPLF, in the 1970s. You know shit is about to hit the fan when Muslims, Christians, and communists decide to work together. And shit did indeed hit the fan when Ethiopia's imperial government fell in 1974, replaced by a Soviet-backed Marxist regime. Despite heavy Soviet military support though, Ethiopia failed to swiftly defeat the Eritrean insurgency. By the late 1980s, the loss of Soviet support and internal rebellions weakened Ethiopia. In 1991, the EPLF captured Asmara, securing Eritrea's de facto independence. A referendum in 1993 confirmed Eritrea's independence, with Isaias Afwerki becoming its first president. So, you just gained independence from a much larger neighbor that hates you. Sound familiar? Well, for Eritrea this became an issue. Despite a good start with economic growth, tensions with Ethiopia soon escalated. A border dispute over the tiny village of Badme led to a war that lasted between 1998 and 2000. 2 years for those of you who can't count. According to various estimates, over 100,000 people lost their lives in the 2-year war over this village. So what was so important about it? It had neither oil nor diamonds, but it did not matter. Both Eritrea and Ethiopia simply wanted it on their side of the border. Peace deal was signed in 2000, but Ethiopia refused to withdraw from some of the disputed territories, and as tensions remained high, Ethiopia accused Eritrea of funding the Somali extremist group Al-Shabaab, which aimed to seize Somali-inhabited regions of Ethiopia. This led to UN sanctions being slapped on Eritrea in 2009, which included an arms embargo, travel bans, and asset freezes on Eritrea over the country's alleged support for Somali insurgents. Domestically, Eritrea's government became more repressive. In 2001, press freedoms were abolished, opposition parties were banned, and infinite conscription into the national army meant to guard against the future conflict with Ethiopia led to a mass exodus of refugees from the country. The UN accused the Eritrean government of widespread human rights abuses, including forced labor and torture. This was ignored though, and both sides seemed to be gearing up for another war. However, in a surprising turn of events, Ethiopia extended a peace offer to Eritrea in 2018, recognizing the 2002 border ruling that placed the village of Badme in Eritrea while assigning the less symbolic areas to Ethiopia. Diplomatic ties were re-established and the state of war officially ended. Following this, the UN Security Council unanimously agreed to lift sanctions on Eritrea after 9 years. Although this may seem like a great thing on paper for Eritrea, the government's justification for indefinite conscription was tied to the conflict with Ethiopia, raising questions about whether the country would end the practice after the peace agreement in 2018. Despite the official end of hostilities, conscription remained in place, forcing many Eritreans to flee in search of freedom and better opportunities. So 2 years after signing a peace treaty with the Eritreans, Ethiopia's Tigray region in the north, which was home to roughly 7 million Tigrinians, declared the Ethiopian government illegitimate under the leadership of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or the TPLF group. What does this have to do with Eritrea? Well, Tigrinians make up the majority of Eritrea's population, and the country's first and only president since 1993, Isaias Afwerki, belongs to the Tigrinya ethnic group. Given the shared ethnic ties, one might expect the natural response to be supporting your fellow ethnic group down south in their fight for independence, right? Wrong. If you remember what I said in the beginning of the video, Emperor Johannes IV of Ethiopia, who was Tigrayan, strongly opposed Eritrea separating, or even worse, becoming a part of Italy. However, his successor, who wasn't Tigrayan, helped to start the conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea by allowing the Italians to divide the area. Following this, Tigrayans felt betrayed, and a few decades later they established the Tigray People's Liberation Front with the goal of overthrowing Ethiopia's central government. It quickly grew into a major armed movement, and by 1991 it played a key role in toppling the communist government of Ethiopia. Since then, the TPLF dominated the Ethiopian government, controlling key political, military, and economic institutions for nearly 3 decades. In fact, during the struggle for Eritrean independence from Ethiopia, the TPLF was a key ally of Eritrea's independence movement, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. However, after the TPLF took control of Ethiopia and Eritrea gained independence, things would slowly start to sour between the factions as Eritrea was still deeply involved in Ethiopia's economy. Eritrea still controlled Ethiopia's ports, meaning they controlled what goods entered and left the country. What was worse for the TPLF, Eritrea initially continued using the Ethiopian currency, the birr. However, in mid-July 1997, Eritrea introduced its own currency, the nakfa, replacing the birr at the 1-to-1 exchange rate. In response, Ethiopia introduced a new version of the Ethiopian birr, effectively rendering the old birr notes held by many, including those in Eritrea, completely worthless. Which obviously made some people upset. The TPLF in Ethiopia also reorganized the country back into an ethnic federal system, which fueled ethnic tensions and civil conflicts across the country. Furthermore, this same TPLF-led government in Ethiopia was responsible for the extremely bloody Badme village war in the early 2000s. It was essentially a conflict where Tigrayans fought against fellow Tigrayans. However, the TPLF's grip on power began to loosen in 2018 when it lost control of the federal government, resulting in the TPLF retreating into the majority-controlled Tigray region and tensions escalated into the Tigray War in 2020. The TPLF's main goal was to regain its political influence, resist the new Ethiopian government's reforms, and reassert its position within Ethiopia's power structure, not to gain independence. Furthermore, the peace deal between the new Ethiopian government and Eritrea in 2018 angered the TPLF, and Eritrea feared a new resurgent TPLF would pose a threat to Eritrean security. All of this meant that the Ethiopian government and Eritrean leadership saw the TPLF as a political and military threat, making their collaboration against the TPLF a natural alliance. Surrounded on all sides and heavily outnumbered, it only took 2 years for the TPLF to be absolutely clapped back into the Stone Age. The Tigray War had killed 600,000 people, split the TPLF up, and left the Tigray region absolutely devastated. So that's the end of the story, right? Wrong again. Firstly, after the signed peace agreement matured for 4 months, the TPLF was removed from the country's list of terrorist organizations on March 22, 2023. Secondly, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed appointed the former deputy head of the TPLF, Getachew Reda, as the leader of the Tigray Interim Administration, or TIA, for a temporary government. The appointment of Reda split the TPLF into 2 factions, and it kind of solved the situation for a while, at least enough to ignore it. The TIA did accuse the remaining TPLF of trying to regain control of Tigray, but Ethiopia kind of had other problems to deal with. In 2023, Ethiopia's leader remarked, by 2030, Ethiopia's population will reach 150 million. A population of 150 million cannot be confined to a landlocked country, referring to the lack of sea access. This sent alarm bells ringing in Eritrea. As the Ethiopian government believed the situation to be solved in the Tigray region, they kind of fucked off for a while shifting their focus to securing port access through Somalia instead. And although the TPLF were no longer terrorists, the Election Board of Ethiopia officially suspended the TPLF as a political party on February 13, 2025 to ensure that they would never get control of the Tigray region again. 1 month later, on March 13th, the TPLF took the capital of the Tigray region by force. Now that you know the political situation of the region, let's look into what could happen. A renewed civil war in the Tigray region could escalate into a regional conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea, 2 longtime rivals. Eritrea aims to weaken Ethiopia, while Ethiopia seeks access to the Red Sea. Recent events suggest that war is very near, with Eritrea mobilizing its military and Ethiopia deploying troops to the Eritrean border. Ethiopian-aligned TIA leaders in the Tigray region have accused external forces of supporting the TPLF attacks in the region, but Eritrea and the TPLF have denied accusations of an alliance, though there are reports of meetings between their leaders, signaling a potential shift in dynamics of the conflict. Furthermore, Eritrean troops still occupy contested border areas in 2025 that they seized in the Tigray region in 2020. It is very likely that in the case of a possible invasion by Ethiopia's military, the Eritrean government wants the Tigray region to serve as a buffer zone. Further south in the Amhara region, the Fano militia, backed by Eritrea and allied with the Ethiopian government against the TPLF, is now in a conflict with the government over disagreements about the Tigray peace deal. On the 22nd of March 2025, Ethiopia's army reported that its troop had killed over 300 fighters from the Fano armed groups during 2 days of clashes in the northern Amhara region. If escalated, a renewed war in the Tigray region or a regional conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia could trigger a severe economic, humanitarian, and security crisis in the Horn of Africa, likely causing even more death and destruction than the 2 previous wars due to the large militaries of both countries. Now, instead of having to worry about being attacked from one side in Yemen, shipping companies in the Red Sea will have to fear threats from both sides. An Ethiopian war could also create opportunities for terrorist groups to exploit the instability, as seen in Sudan, South Sudan, and Somalia, where groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda have expanded. These groups would likely target Ethiopia to establish safe havens and recruit fighters. The situation could eventually lead to both Ethiopia's and Eritrea's government to collapse, but the Prime Minister of Ethiopia has expressed his commitment to resolving this diplomatically, leaving us with no other choice but to wait and see how it unfolds.